Okay, so just to get started a little bit, let's see if I can. I want to just talk a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I just want to briefly describe the symptoms of myotonic dystrophy, and then we'll go into the genetics of the conditions, and then talk about the different types of genetic testing that are involved. So myotonic dystrophy, I certainly feel like I am preaching to the choir here. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I know that you are living with this condition, so you know a lot more about this than I do. So some of the symptoms that people with myotonic dystrophy experience, of course, this is primarily known as a muscle condition, so there's muscle weakness involved, but it's not only a muscle condition, and I'm going to go into a little bit about why that is later. But one of the big features of myotonic dystrophy is myotonia, since it's in the name and everything. Myotonia is a very specific type of muscle condition where basically there is an inability to relax after contraction of the muscles. So most often people will notice this in their hands. If they're gripping something, if they go to shake a hand with somebody, it's hard to let go, things like that. Other symptoms of myotonic dystrophy that people know about are cataracts. So people with myotonic dystrophy get cataracts pretty early in life. It's often a very specific type of cataract. So if you go to the ophthalmologist and they mention something like Christmas tree cataract, that's what they're talking about here, a very specific type of cataracts for myotonic dystrophy. And they name them that because if they shine a light on it the correct way, it kind of the cataracts kind of sparkle in a certain way. So they named that Christmas tree cataracts. Another part of the condition is cardiomyopathy. So people with myotonic dystrophy can get arrhythmias of the heart, so a problem with the rhythm of the heart. And that can lead to problems with the muscles in the heart, which is termed cardiomyopathy. Additional symptoms can involve many different parts of the body. So the endocrine system can be involved with different hormone-related problems. Also, diabetes is people with myotonic dystrophy are very high risk for diabetes. Early frontal balding is often a sign that's known. So men and women can have some early thinning of the hair. And then intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities can also be a feature. So what's important to realize is that myotonic dystrophy will affect people differently, even within the same family. Not everybody gets all of these symptoms, and some people will have more severe symptoms in some of these categories than other people. So not everybody with myotonic dystrophy has the same symptoms. Some people have more significant symptoms than other people. A little bit about the muscle weakness. So the areas shown in red here are the muscles that are most often associated with muscle weakness for myotonic dystrophy. So the lower legs, we call that the distal legs. We'll often notice symptoms there first, and that will include things like foot drop. So sometimes people might need some braces at the ankles to help them walk. We also notice some muscle weakness at the distal arms or the ends of the ends of the arms, the hands. So some people will notice some problems with fine motor function, doing buttons, zippers, writing, things like that. We also notice muscle weakness of the neck and the face muscles. And so you might know that sometimes people with myotonic dystrophy have a very specific look to their face. And this generally is because of a muscle weakness that happens in the face muscles. And so sometimes you might, hear people call the muscles in the face a little bit droopy, and that's because those muscles aren't as strong as they should be. So that also, you can kind of see the red by the eyes. And so people with myotonic dystrophy will also have what's called ptosis, which is a drooping of the eyelids. And that's another type of that facial muscle weakness. Now, the other big muscle piece that we can't ignore is that diaphragm right there in the middle. So people with myotonic dystrophy can get muscle weakness with their breathing, or that diaphragm that's below the lungs. So we know that people with this condition are at risk for respiratory problems, and that's something that we watch over time and monitor really closely for them. So now I am jumping right into the genetics. So I would like to first give a background information about genetics so that we're all on the same page. So bear with me here with a little bit of junior high biology background here. So this picture here is a picture of chromosomes, and this may be what you might see if you were looking at chromosomes under a microscope. So they're all, wiggling around all over the place. We all have all of our chromosomes in every cell of our body. We all have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. The first 22 pairs are what we call autosomes. That just means that those chromosomes are both in males and in females. And then the last pair, is the 23rd pair, is the sex chromosome. So an X and a Y would be a male, or two X chromosomes would be a female. So these chromosomes that are in every one of our cells are made up of DNA. So basically every chromosome that we have, it carries thousands of genes. And so the DNA in our chromosomes are basically just really, really tightly wound, and then very specific section of DNA is what's called a gene. So this means that we have every single gene in every cell of our body. We have over 20,000 different genes. So the gene that I want to talk about for myotonic dystrophy type 1 is called DMPK. And this gene is located on the 19th chromosome. So the number of the chromosome isn't necessarily all that important, except it is not one of the sex chromosomes. So that means it's an autosome. That means that both males and females are equally at risk to get this condition. It doesn't matter what sex you are. So that's what, when you look at autosomal dominant inheritance, that's what that autosomal piece means. It just means both males and females can get this condition. So this DMPK gene is named basically from the Latin word of the protein, dystrophin myotonia. But this gene is on the 19th chromosome. We all have two copies of the 19th chromosome, so that means we all have two copies of this DMPK gene. We got one copy from our mom, and we got one copy from our dad. Now, the genetic change that I'm going to talk about here in a second that causes myotonic dystrophy, that genetic change is only on one copy of the DMPK gene that you have. So, I should back up. So we all have this DMPK gene. So it's not that people with myotonic dystrophy have a different gene than anybody else. Everybody has this DMPK gene. And we all have two copies, one from mom and one from dad. But there's a genetic change on one copy of the gene in people that have myotonic dystrophy. So what that means is people with myotonic dystrophy has one gene that has the change, one gene that doesn't have the change. So when they have a child, they either are going to pass down the gene that has the change in it, or they're going to pass down the gene that doesn't have the change in it. And that is a 50-50 chance to pass that on to a child. So that is the dominant part of the autosomal dominant inheritance. So having the one change is enough for you to actually have symptoms of the condition. So that's the dominant part of it. So if somebody has myotonic dystrophy, every child that they have has a 50-50 chance of inheriting this gene change. Every child they have also has a 50-50 chance of inheriting the gene that doesn't have the gene change. And if a child doesn't inherit that gene change, they don't have myotonic dystrophy, and then they cannot pass it on to their children. If they do inherit it, then it's a 50-50 chance that they pass it on to their children. So a little bit about the specific genetic change in the myotonic dystrophy gene, or the DMPK gene. So in order to describe this, I want to back up just a little bit to what DNA is. So DNA is made up of letters that we call these nucleotides, but we just use letters to describe them. So the A, T, C, and G. Our entire DNA is just made up of these 4 letters. It's quite amazing. Those letters just get rearranged into different genetic words, and we tend to use genetic words in 3-letter words. So 3 letters will encode for a specific amino acid. And so the 3 letters that are important for this particular condition is CTG. So in this DMPK gene, there is a repeated segment of DNA of CTG, CTG, CTG. So everybody that has this gene, which is everybody has this repeat. Now, people who have myotonic dystrophy actually have more of these repeats than they're supposed to have. CTG, CTG, CTG. So there's more of them. So what that means is that when that DNA is getting processed, there's more of that specific type of amino acid that goes along with that particular genetic word. And that means that within the processing, the protein or the RNA or the messengers that get made is more big, is larger than it's supposed to be. And this is kind of what causes the problem within the cells, this big abnormal messenger RNA. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that. So if somebody is getting genetic testing done for myotonic dystrophy, which is just a blood draw, by the way, the laboratory will extract their DNA. They specifically locate this area of the genome, this part of the DNA, and then they count the number of repeats that they see there. And when I say that they count the number of repeats, it's not quite as simple as just going through and saying 1, 2, 3, 4. They use a very specific technique that looks at how large the product of this is. And so they can't get very specific to the number of repeats, but they can have ranges of number of repeats. And I believe that somebody asked a question about that, so I'll talk about that in a little bit. But kind of getting at that, when the lab does the test, it gives you kind of a range of number of repeats. It can't always give you the very specific number. So when the laboratory comes back with a number or a type of range of numbers, that gives us an idea of kind of the perhaps age of onset that we might see for somebody. So when somebody has 34 repeats or less, that is the normal number of repeats. So somebody with 34 repeats or less will not have myotonic dystrophy, and they will not pass it on to a child. The cutoff is 50. So when there is 50 repeats or more, that is considered a positive test result. When somebody has more than 1,000 repeats, we would expect them to show symptoms very early in life, and oftentimes we'll call that congenital myotonic dystrophy. I'll go into a little bit more about that too. So going back to here, one thing I just want to explain that's very important for our purposes today is that when a parent has an expanded repeat, that's what we call the genetic mutation in this condition, an expansion or expanded repeat. When a parent has this gene mutation, when they pass it on to a child, the number of repeats can change. The number of repeats can get larger or it can get smaller. We know for some reason that when a mother passes the gene expansion on, it is a little bit more unstable and can expand further than we generally see when a male passes on the gene. We don't fully understand why that is. There's some theories, but I don't think it's actually been proven as to why, when it comes from a mother, it has the possibility to expand a little bit more. So just like I said, just to say that one more time, when a parent passes this gene expansion onto a child, the number of repeats can change. So that means that if one person in the family gets genetic testing and gets a number back, that number of repeats, that will be different than somebody else in the family who gets genetic testing back and gets a number of repeats. So that would be as expected. Now, when the repeat number gets larger, when this expansion gets larger, we expect symptoms to show up earlier in life. And that's kind of what we're talking about here with these cutoffs. So if somebody has the lowest number that they could have and still be called a positive test result, still have a diagnosis of myotonic dystrophy, 50, we might expect symptoms to happen a little bit later in life than as compared to somebody who shows over 1,000 repeats. So somebody with the larger number of repeats happens earlier in life, the symptoms. Now, another thing that I want to stress with this condition, when you do genetic testing, you get two numbers back. You get a number of repeats on the gene that you inherited from one parent, and you get a number of repeats that was inherited on the gene from the other parent. So oftentimes if somebody gets a genetic testing result that comes back positive, they might get a number, let's say 5 on one gene, and so that would be the gene that they inherited from the parent that did not have the condition. And then perhaps they have a repeat along with that that's something like 350 to 500. And so that is the expanded repeat. And it's a range of repeats because they can't get specifically down to the very specific number of repeats. And that's based on the testing that's done, the way that the test is done in the laboratory. Now, even though we can say that the more repeats that somebody has, the earlier the symptoms are going to happen, we can never predict what's going to happen. So if somebody were to get tested very early in their life and they came back with a certain number, we're not going to be able to say, oh, this is your number. You're going to get symptoms at age 28, and these are what the symptoms are. We cannot get that type of get specific like that with genetic testing. This is really kind of a general type of thing with the more repeats, the earlier the age of onset, but it's not something that we can use to predict what's going to happen for one individual person. So that's important to keep in mind. Another thing to think about with these numbers is that the larger the repeat number is, the more unstable that particular gene is as it gets passed on in a family. And so what that means is that if, say, a woman who is starting a family, she has myotonic dystrophy and she gets genetic testing and she's found to have 50 repeats in one of her genes. We know that she does have a 50% risk to pass that gene on to her children, but what are the chances that that gene will go repeat number will go from 50 to 1,000 in her child? So that is a possibility, certainly even when a woman has 50 repeats. But her chances is going to be less than, say, a woman who has 850 repeats, and that woman's chances. So because the woman with 850 repeats start off with more repeats in her gene, that makes that particular gene more unstable than the gene that had the 50 in it. So the larger the number of repeats, the more instability it has when it gets passed on in a family, and the more likely it is to change numbers as it gets passed on. So that means that somebody who has a repeat in the 500 to 800 range has a higher chance of having a baby born with problems or a congenital type of myotonic dystrophy than, say, somebody who has a repeat in the 50 range or in the 100 range. Okay. So a little bit about I didn't go into too much about the congenital myotonic dystrophy, but congenital myotonic dystrophy is basically when somebody has the symptoms of myotonic dystrophy right at the time that they were born, or perhaps even before they were born while they were in utero. And most often, the symptoms that we notice are really hard time breathing. And so babies are born with respiratory distress. And sometimes babies are really sick and they don't make it. And so we want people to understand that this is a chance for people who have myotonic dystrophy, that there is a risk that their babies can be born with congenital myotonic dystrophy if those repeat numbers expand up into a range that causes the symptoms. So before I move on to all the different types of genetic testing, I want to just briefly talk about the genetics of myotonic dystrophy type 2. So myotonic dystrophy type 2 is caused by a genetic change in the CNBP gene. And it is also a repeat disorder. But this time it's not just the triplet repeat, but it's a quadruple repeat. So, but it's the same situation where when there's more of the repeats than that's supposed to be there, then it causes an abnormal RNA protein, and the same issues happen with the genetic mutation. Now, this repeat number is going to be 75, so the cutoff is a little bit different. Now, what makes this complicated for both myotonic dystrophy type 1 and type 2 is that this number of repeats actually change between the cells in our body. So, say that we take blood and we look at the number of repeats in the cells that are in somebody's blood sample. That may not be the exact same number of repeats that is in the cells in the muscles, let's say, or in the cells in the sperm. So when we actually test and count those number of repeats, we are almost taking an educated guess as to what is the number of repeats throughout the body, because we're not going to take a biopsy of the heart just to check how many number of repeats are in that tissue. So when we get those test results back, we have to take that with a grain of salt, knowing that first of all, we're looking only at the blood cells when we look at those test results, and that we don't have a way to look at what the repeat numbers is in the rest of the body. Also, to make things even more complicated, is as our cells in our body divide and grow and divide, the number of repeats even within our own cells as they grow and divide can change. So even that complicates the number of repeats that somebody might have. When we talk about the number of repeats to somebody, we have to be very careful when we say, oh, this is the number of repeats, so we think that your symptoms are going to be more severe because your repeats are this high. Well, what if the number of repeats in the muscle isn't that high? Maybe they'll have very mild muscle disease because their muscles didn't have that high of repeat. And so all of this is not, we have to be very careful when we think that we are able to predict what might be happening with somebody. And that's because we can't test every single cell in the body to determine what those number of repeats are for people. So to kind of talk a little bit about why this genetic change, this expansion of the DNA in this gene causes all the different symptoms that can happen with myotonic dystrophy. Basically, what's very interesting is it's not necessarily that this gene gets shut off, and so then that gene doesn't work and you're missing a certain amount of the gene product, and that's what causes the symptoms. For this genetic condition, what actually happens is this, what we call RNA, which is basically when the DNA is processed, it makes a molecule called RNA. When that is in the cells, the longer RNA basically will, because it's so long, because of that increased number of repeats, it folds over on itself, and then it starts to kind of what I consider gum up the works, basically, in the cell. And it starts to interfere with the interaction of a lot of the other genes that are being expressed in that exact same cell. And so the RNA from the DMPK gene will interfere with certain genes that are responsible for how the heart works, how the endocrine system works, all of that. So that's why all those other symptoms happen within myotonic dystrophy, and that's called RNA toxicity. Now, there are actually genetic therapies that are on the horizon that are looking at how to basically kind of stop this interaction that's going on in the cell, and hopefully be able to degrade the DMPK abnormal gene that's kind of gumming up the works, and then help get things moving again like it's supposed to. So there are small molecule therapies that are being in the works right now, trying to help with that. So I want to talk now about the different types of genetic testing. So I think that everybody probably aware of diagnostic genetic testing. And what that is when somebody has symptoms of a genetic condition and the doctor says, this is what I think you have, and here we can do a blood test and do a genetic test to confirm that that's what you have. So that is called diagnostic genetic testing. So if somebody has a diagnosis of myotonic dystrophy and they get genetic testing to confirm that diagnosis, that doesn't change anything in terms of the diagnosis, insurance discrimination, things like that, because you already have a clinical diagnosis. When your doctor says, I think this is what you have, that's when they give you a clinical diagnosis. So when you already have a clinical diagnosis, getting the genetic diagnosis to confirm that doesn't change many things. So that's diagnostic testing. So I want to change gears now and talk about a different type of testing called presymptomatic testing. This is when somebody decides that they want to get genetic testing because they have the condition in their family and they know that they're at risk to inherit the genetic condition, and they want to know, did I inherit it or did I not inherit it? So we call this presymptomatic testing because the person themselves aren't showing any symptoms currently of the disease. This type of testing is very different than diagnostic testing. So generally, somebody who's going through presymptomatic testing is a healthy individual. They're not showing any signs or symptoms of this condition. But because of their family history, they know they're at risk. So some reasons that people will decide to get presymptomatic testing, there's many different reasons, but ultimately it's a very personal decision. So some people decide to get presymptomatic testing because their parent had myotonic dystrophy, they're ready to start a family, and they don't have signs themselves, but they know they're at risk, and they want to know if their child is going to be at risk for myotonic dystrophy. So that's one reason somebody might decide to get tested. Another reason might be that they just want to know. They know that their parent has it. They know they're at risk. They want to know if they have it or not, just purely curiosity. They want to plan. They feel like they're going to have a better idea what to do with their life, what to do in their career, what to do with their family if they know whether they have it or they don't have it. So those are definitely some reasons people decide to do genetic testing. Certainly there are reasons people decide not to do genetic testing. Sometimes people, they're like, well, if I'm going to get the symptoms, I'm going to get the symptoms. So I can't do anything to change it. So I don't want to know. So there's a lot of people that just don't want to know because there's nothing that we can do to change the outcome. Now, we don't necessarily recommend doing pre-symptomatic testing of children. This is kind of a controversial statement for myotonic dystrophy. So certainly when a genetic condition doesn't happen until adulthood, it's well known in the genetics community that we don't test children because we want the children to have a say in whether or not they get that genetic testing done, since it's not going to happen until they're adults. But with myotonic dystrophy, it's not always an adult onset condition. So sometimes, obviously, children will show symptoms. So when is it appropriate to test a child for this condition, though? And that's hard to say. And it really is a conversation that needs to happen with the family. So first, you might think, well, of course we want to test the kids because they're at risk for a heart condition, or they're at risk for diabetes, or they could get muscle weakness. Well, we don't necessarily have to do a genetic test to watch out for certain things, right? So if somebody is at risk to have myotonic dystrophy, we would recommend that they get their heart checked by their doctor once a year, that they get their glucose checked once a year. And as long as everything is looking good, there's no reason to move forward with genetic testing. But as long as you're getting those things checked out, you would hopefully detect any major problems that could arise. So that is the main reason why we don't necessarily recommend testing in children, is because there is pretty easy surveillance that can be done for the possible complications. Usually, if there is going to be complications, most of the time they don't happen early in childhood. Otherwise, it would be very kind of obvious that they inherited it. So if that makes sense, a lot of times the symptoms of the muscle weakness might come earlier, like the congenital myotonic dystrophy. So then, and the other reason is that there's nothing that we can do to change the outcome. So for those reasons, we don't recommend testing in childhood. Now, if there is a child who knows about their risk, which we of course recommend everybody is open and honest about myotonic dystrophy in the family. So if perhaps there's a child who understands that they're at risk and they are very anxious about this, it's something they think about all the time, it's really causing them harm in their life, not to know, that might be a reason that we might go ahead and do the genetic testing. But other than that, there isn't necessarily a good reason to test a child who isn't showing any symptoms. I'm sure I might have some questions about that come up. So moving on from talking about children to talking about adults. So adults who know that they are at risk for myotonic dystrophy and decide that they want to do genetic testing to find out whether they inherited the condition or not, we recommend that they go through a process in order to get that testing done. And that process starts with genetic counseling. So we would have that person come in and meet with a genetic counselor. They would learn a lot of the things that I'm talking about with you today, the genetics of the condition, the pros and cons of doing genetic testing. And some of the cons that we want to make sure that we talk about at that visit is the possibility of genetic discrimination. Now, when I say genetic discrimination, I'm mainly talking about certain types of insurance or employment opportunities, things like that. Now, what's important to realize is this current moment in time, we have protections in place for our health insurance. So the Affordable Care Act and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, those are two federal laws that protect people from pre-existing conditions in the ACA's case, or from a positive genetic test result. So there are protections in place for health insurance for those things. Now, that's not set in stone. If the Affordable Care Act were to change, or if there's pre-existing clause gets changed, that all might change. But what is protected in the Genetic Information of Non-Discrimination Act, if somebody were to test positive, they have protections in place for their health insurance and for their employment. So if they were to test positive, they cannot be discriminated against for their employment. So if they're up for a promotion, nobody can take into account their gene status or anything like that. But what is not protected is life insurance, long-term care insurance, disability insurance, things like that. So if someone were to go through genetic testing, get genetic testing and come back positive for myotonic dystrophy, and then they go and apply for life insurance, there's a good chance they're going to get denied, or at the very least have to pay a lot more money to get coverage. So at this first genetic counseling appointment, we're telling them about these risks and allowing them to put those things in place. So you can go get you can go get life insurance before you get genetic testing. Now, you're obviously, when you apply for these types of insurance, you can't lie or anything like that. So if they ask about your family history, myotonic dystrophy might come up. But if they ask, have you ever tested positive for a genetic condition, you can answer honestly and say no, because you haven't been tested. So if you were to put those things in place, you go through, get genetic testing, it comes back negative, then you can go back and cancel those policies if you don't want to continue paying on them the rest of your life. But if you were to test positive, then you have those policies in place. They can't take them away from you as long as you're paying on those premiums. Now, there is some things in the fine print that you want to be careful about. Sometimes if you get a diagnosis within 6 months, they might, say that's void or something like that. So you have to look at the small print. But so that's a big piece of the genetic counseling session. We want to make sure people are prepared for that type of genetic discrimination that they know about, and get those things in place. Also, at the genetic counseling session, we just make sure that they're well aware of what the condition is. Occasionally, we get people who were adopted out, and we need to explain the condition a little bit more. And we also just want to make sure that they realize, what the condition is, that they're making an informed decision. Oftentimes at that very first visit, we'll offer a neurologic exam, and that's mainly to look for any signs or symptoms of the condition. So if sometimes somebody's coming to us because they want to know whether they have the condition because they feel they have symptoms. Well, if we do a neurologic exam and say we don't find any signs or symptoms of the condition, sometimes they're like, oh, well, I guess I don't want to do genetic testing. That's really all I wanted to know, was whether I'm having symptoms right now. So then they're fine. Or sometimes we can do a neurologic exam and we see really, really mild signs of the condition. And we talk about that, and then maybe they don't feel the need to go forward and get genetic testing. We can let them know that we actually see some signs on the exam, so most likely the thing is they did inherit it. So that's why we offer that exam for the first time they come in. Now, generally, we don't do a blood draw that very first time they come in when they don't have any signs or symptoms of the condition. And again, we want to give them time to get those insurances in place, maybe think it over, make sure they want to know this information. And then we have them come back, and we often will have them speak with a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And this is to make sure that there isn't any underlying mental health issues that need to be addressed prior to doing this type of genetic testing, that they have a support system in place, that they have people there that are able to support them, that they're ready to hear this information. And then the genetic test will be drawn at that second visit, oftentimes if they want to go forward. And then generally we talk about those test results in person. And so there is kind of a process that we put in place for doing testing for people who don't have symptoms. And a lot of that has to do, we want to make sure that you're well educated prior to getting that blood drawn and getting that test done. Now, there are some other types of testing, and I apologize, I don't have the slides for these, but this is what I call prenatal testing. And it might be a misnomer because sometimes some of these tests are offered before even somebody gets pregnant. But basically, this is testing that is available to prevent from passing this on to the next generation. This type of testing is not necessarily something everybody would do. It's a very personal decision. So one possibility of testing in order to change the outcome for the next generation is basically what we call pre-implantation genetic diagnosis through in vitro fertilization. So that is when a couple will go through prenatal or in vitro fertilization, where the egg and sperm are combined outside of the body. Generally, when you go through that procedure, multiple embryos are made, and basically the laboratory can take a single cell from each embryo and test that embryo to see if it inherited the gene expansion. And they can kind of tell how large that expansion is. That gives information to the parents on which embryos actually inherited the gene expansion so that the family can decide which embryos they actually want to implant. And so if you can imagine being those parents, you probably aren't going to choose to implant the embryo that has a number of repeats that would go have a baby born very sick with congenital myotonic dystrophy. Since it's a 50-50 in terms of passing down that gene expansion, you would expect that 50% of the embryos would have the non-expanded gene from that parent. So you would expect a good proportion of the embryos to be unaffected with myotonic dystrophy. Again, thinking the parents would decide to implant those embryos. Another possibility is if somebody is pregnant naturally or is currently pregnant, there are ways that you can test the pregnancy. And you can do that as early as 11 weeks and as late as 21 weeks. And basically the thought is you test the pregnancy to see if that pregnancy inherited the condition, and then a decision is made on whether to continue the pregnancy or not. So those are all different ways of testing in order to prevent from the gene getting passed on in the family. There are obviously other methods of family planning, such as if a man has myotonic dystrophy, you could use sperm donation. Or if a woman has myotonic dystrophy, you could go through in vitro fertilization and use egg donation. And that would just take out that person's DNA completely from the conception. And then, of course, there's always adoption or deciding not to have children also. Not to mention, moving forward, knowing that 50-50 risk and hoping for the best, knowing that parent had myotonic dystrophy, they're going to know how their child might show symptoms. They're going to know how to help their child deal with the psychological aspect of having symptoms, of having this condition. So many people decide to move forward without any type of testing, and they know that they will know how to best support their child, whether they have myotonic dystrophy or not. So I'm going to stop there and let some of you ask some questions.
Okay, so if somebody has a question, please raise your hand on the GoToWebinar platform and I can unmute you. All right, let's see. So Jennifer Johnson is wondering about testing for DM1 versus DM2. How does somebody know which test they should get, and how would they go about doing that?
That's a great question. So if somebody has never had genetic testing in the family, so basically that's the first thing to think about. If somebody else in your family has had genetic testing and it confirmed myotonic dystrophy type 1, then you don't need to do genetic testing for myotonic dystrophy type 2. If somebody has type 1 in the family, everybody is going to have type 1 that has it in the family. If nobody has had genetic testing, then the first person to get genetic testing, it really needs to be a physician or genetic counselor that helps to determine which test they should start with. So myotonic dystrophy type 1 is by far the more common of the two, by a lot. So most people, if they're going to get genetic testing, should start with myotonic dystrophy type 1. If somebody tests negative for myotonic dystrophy type 1, then the next thing to consider is myotonic dystrophy type 2. Now, rarely somebody might have a very specific presentation that goes with type 2, and then the doctor will say, let's start with type 2 because I think it's going to be type 2. And so if somebody doesn't have quite as much muscle weakness and it's more pain, and they don't have necessarily a lot of the other things going on with it, then maybe we'll think about starting with type 2. But even then, oftentimes we still start with type 1 just because it is so much more common. So really that should be directed by the doctor, but most often you start with type 1, and if that comes back negative, then you try type 2.
Okay, got it. Any other questions? Let's see. Sorry about this. I'm just trying to figure out how to get back to this questions page. 1 second. Okay, I'm going to unmute Erin Buchler. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if the number of repeats can increase as you get older, or are you born with the number of repeats that you're going to have for your entire life?
Another great question. So in general, say you get genetic testing when you're 15, you get a blood sample taken, they count the number of repeats that are seen in your blood at that time. You basically can think about that's the number of repeats that you have. And that's a very general way to think about it. Now, when the cells in your body are changing throughout your life, there can be some changes in those number of repeats, but you're talking about changes from cell to cell, and so it's not necessarily going to change the number of repeats that are in your blood sample. So if you were to get blood sample taken when you're 15, get a number of repeats, and then you get a blood sample taken when you're 70 and get another number of repeats, it's probably going to be similar in terms of the range of the repeats. So I wouldn't expect that to be a lot different. But when you talk about individual cells within your body, they may change a little bit as those cells replicate. But it's not necessarily, the repeats aren't changing in your entire body all at once, is from cell to cell, if that makes sense.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. I'm going to unmute Aaron Reynolds if you want to ask your question. Aaron Reynolds?
Yes?
You can go ahead and ask your question now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to know if you know what the latest treatments for MD1 are.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I just want to know what are the latest treatments for MD1?
The latest treatments. So I'm gonna be honest and let you know that I'm not a physician, and so I don't work on the treatment side of things very much. Currently, the treatments tend to be mainly at symptomatic treatments. So if somebody has a lot of myotonia, there are certain medications that might help loosen those muscles a little bit. If somebody is having a lot of GI problems, they'll use treatments, specifically medications to treat those symptoms. But right now, at this moment in time, there isn't necessarily any medication treatments that are aimed at changing the underlying cause of the condition or changing the outcome of the condition.
Okay. I'm going to unmute Beth Marquette if you have a question. It looks like she's not available. Okay, so let's move on to James Simmons. Do you have a question? You need to unmute yourself if you're able to. Okay, not working for him either. What about Joel Marquette? Nope. Okay, you have to unmute yourself if I say your name, please. Beth Marquette, do you want to unmute yourself? Okay. Not happening. Seems like. Oh,
Okay,
Beth, you're on the line.
Thank
Beth,
you.
go ahead.
I was just wondering, for kind of that elective testing, maybe pre-symptomatic testing, if your insurance won't cover it, what are you looking at in terms of cost? And then I had another question. Are there any current studies for families that
So so I'm just going to repeat the question, make sure I'm getting that right. So one question is, are there current studies for families? And then
correct?
the other question was for how much might the testing cost if insurance doesn't cover it? Yes.
That's correct.
Okay. So great questions. So the genetic cost of the genetic testing, like if you just do type 1, is probably close to $1,000. If you do not have symptoms, that's going to be the highest risk for the insurance not to cover it, because they don't see that as medically necessary usually if you don't have symptoms. If you work with a genetic counselor, they can often help figure out kind of ahead of time what it might cost for you so that you don't kind of go in blind and not know. And they also can, sometimes try and get that covered by insurance for you. So if you have any concerns about costs of testing, genetic counselors are a really good resource to go through. The studies. So we actually have a study here at the University of Iowa that is an imaging study, and they're looking at they're doing brain MRIs in people with myotonic dystrophy, and then they also are doing things like cognitive testing and intelligence testing and things like that. So they're trying to determine what the underlying changes are in the brain and how that affects people with myotonic dystrophy, because there hasn't been a lot of studies with that yet. So that is a study that's going on here at the University of Iowa. As far as I'm aware, most of the current research studies that are happening, are mainly kind of gathering information. So currently right now, I'm not aware of any human clinical trials for treatments. So treatments where they're giving people medication trials and seeing if they work. I think that most of those treatments are still in the animal models right now. So research studies are more about observing and learning how things change over time for people, so that when we have those treatments, we can show that those treatments change the outcome and can show that those treatments are working.
Okay, well, I want to honor Tiffany's time since it's been about an hour. So for those of you who weren't able to ask your questions, you can feel free to email them to me, and either myself or Tiffany will address them. But thank you so much, Tiffany, for your time. This has been a great webinar. And to everybody on the line, these slides will be posted on our website, and the audio will also be available on our website. So you can listen in again whenever you have a chance. So again, thank you so much for your time, Tiffany, and I hope everybody else has a great rest of their day.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Take care.